Enya's history has recorded him as the embodiment of absolute evil, a demon on the podium whose guttural screams hypnotized millions and plunged the world into the furnace of war. We are accustomed to seeing Adolf Hitler as a monumental figure, frozen in fury in history textbooks, a dictator, a strategist, a tyrant. Yet, behind the facade of propaganda, the loud speeches, and military parades lay a different reality. There, behind the closed doors of his residences, lived a man who woke up every morning, brushed his teeth, ate breakfast, and fell into the gloom of routine. What actually happened in his offices when the cameras were turned off? The answer lies in the details of his schedule, frighteningly mundane and surreal at the same time. This is not a story about a great leader, but about a man who built himself a gilded cage of habits to hide from a burning world. Unlike most world leaders, whose phones were ringing off the hook at dawn, Hitler's bedroom remained immersed in silence until midday. While Churchill was already studying reports from the front lines and Stalin was finishing night meetings, the Führer of the Third Reich slept. His schedule was turned upside down. He was a creature of the night, and morning for him arrived when respectable citizens were already thinking about lunch. Usually, he did not wake up before 11 a.m. This was an iron rule, dared to be broken only in the event of a catastrophe. The reason was simple. Hitler rarely went to bed before 3 or 4 in the morning. His body demanded recovery, but even the process of waking up was turned into a ritual. No alarm clocks were allowed. Hitler despised sharp sounds in the morning. He was convinced that being forcibly woken by a mechanism's ringing destroyed the nervous system and drained a person of energy. To feel strong and think clearly, he had to wake up naturally. As the clock hands approached 11, Heinz Linge, his personal valet, would slip into the bedroom like a shadow. Linge acted like a ghost. He carefully drew back the heavy curtains that tightly blocked out the sunlight, letting the day into the room. Then, a tray was placed on the bedside table, a cup of tea, and a few biscuits. This was how the dictator's day began. Slowly, calmly, in complete silence. No rush, no urgent reports. Hitler savored these minutes of peace, as if reassembling himself piece by piece before putting on the mask of the leader. His morning toilette took an incredibly long time. Hitler could spend up to 45 minutes bathing, shaving, and dressing. He was pedantic about his appearance. Every detail of his uniform had to be perfect, because he knew the moment he stepped over the threshold of the bedroom, he would become the object of universal attention. But until he stood before the mirror, the world could wait. It was only in the afternoon, when the sun had already passed its zenith, that Hitler formally assumed his duties as Germany's leader. Usually, this happened past midday, closer to lunchtime. At this time, the first updates began to arrive. Military adjutants brought folders with reports, briefing him on the situation on the front lines of World War II, or the state of affairs within the country. However, if you imagine Hitler hunched over maps and issuing lightning-fast orders, you are mistaken. These meetings rarely resembled tense strategic sessions. Hitler did not like to delve into the details of logistics. He did not sit for hours working out supply plans or division movements. His management style was different. He preferred to listen. He sat in a chair, often with an absent look, nodding or reacting briefly, allowing others to speak. He absorbed information like a sponge, but rarely acted instantly. His decisions were often impulsive, based on intuition rather than dry calculation. Moreover, Hitler hated the very process of administrative work. Paperwork caused him physical repulsion. He could not stand reading boring reports, signing forms, or following bureaucratic rules. Anything that seemed like routine to him was immediately shifted onto the shoulders of his entourage. Even the telephone was an enemy to him. Hitler had a pathological dislike for talking on the phone, preferring personal contact or passing messages through intermediaries. This is where the figure of Martin Bormann entered the stage. This man became the Führer's shadow, his indispensable gatekeeper. Bormann controlled the flow of information with frightening efficiency. He decided who would get access to the body and whose calls would be ignored. If news was too disturbing, complex, or, in Bormann's opinion, unimportant, it simply did not reach Hitler. The Führer lived in an information cocoon, the walls of which grew thicker every year. But there was one thing Hitler did with religious fanaticism. He read newspapers. His narcissism demanded constant nourishment. He craved to know how the world saw him, what was being written about Germany abroad, and how his image was being broadcast inside the Reich. Special attention was paid to the front pages with loud headlines. Often, he would scribble angry notes in the margins or complain aloud about the stupidity of journalists. Reading the press was one of the few duties he performed daily and without coercion. Lunch was the first truly big event of the day, but even it rarely started before 2 p.m. By this point, hunger was already tormenting everyone present, but no one dared touch the food before the host arrived. Hitler's gastronomic habits were the subject of endless gossip and legends. He was a staunch vegetarian. Refusing meat was not just a diet for him, but a moral and ideological stance. He considered eating animals something dirty, unhealthy, and ethically wrong. Hitler believed that such a diet purified the body and prolonged life, which looked like a grim irony against the backdrop of millions of deaths sanctioned by his signature. His plate looked ascetic: vegetable soup, mashed potatoes, rice with cooked carrots, sometimes soft-boiled eggs, no delicacies, no spices, and certainly no alcohol. While his generals and guests might allow themselves a glass of wine or beer, though even this was not encouraged, Hitler drank only water or herbal infusions. But the hardest trial for the guests was not the bland food, but the atmosphere. Strict rules reigned at the table. No one started eating until Hitler picked up his fork. Even if the soup was getting cold, everyone waited. Lunches dragged on for hours. 2 hours at the table was the norm, but not because the meal was abundant. The reason was Hitler's love for his own voice. As soon as he satisfied his initial hunger, the monologue began. It was not a conversation. It was a lecture. Hitler could wax poetic for hours about the architecture of Linz, the history of ancient Rome, the benefits of vegetarianism, or the flaws of modern music. His assistants, secretaries, adjutants, and even high-ranking guests sat silently. They nodded, feigned interest, but inside they languished from boredom. To object was unthinkable. To interrupt was dangerous. People turned into props for a one-man show. The silence was broken only by the clinking of cutlery and the monotonous voice of a man who considered his banal ramblings the pinnacle of wisdom. Wherever Hitler was, in the damp concrete bunker of the Wolf's Lair amidst the Polish forests, or at the luxurious Berghof residence in the Bavarian Alps, his afternoon routine remained unchanged. He sought to escape. Of course, formally, he might dedicate time to watching military newsreels or briefly reading generals' reports, but his thoughts were already far away. Hitler hated bad news, and as the war dragged on, there was less and less good news. To avoid facing reality, he went for a walk. At the Berghof, these walks resembled a pastoral idyll torn out of the context of a bloody era. Hitler would slowly stroll along stone paths, admiring the majestic peaks of the Alps, breathing in the fresh mountain air. Beside him was often Eva Braun, his longtime companion, whose life was completely subordinate to his whims, or a group of intimates. But even here, amidst nature, he could not simply be silent. The walk was another stage. Hitler would begin to speak again. Topics varied from racial theory to sentimental memories of his youth in Vienna. These were serious, heavy speeches. His companions walked obediently beside him, listening to the same stories for the 100th time. But these walks had a hidden, darker purpose. They served as a defense mechanism. If a report arrived in the morning about a bombed city or an army retreat, Hitler used the walk to erase it from memory. He physically distanced himself from problems. Instead of solving crisis issues, he preferred to discuss the grandeur of nature or listen to the music of Richard Wagner. The powerful chords of his favorite composer helped him restore his mental balance and forget that somewhere far away, his soldiers were dying. With the onset of darkness, Hitler finally cast aside the role of statesman. Evenings were sacred. It was time for entertainment, and he jealously guarded it from any intrusions of the outside world. No reports, no calls, no mentions of the war. The evening existed for pleasure. Dinner started late, around 8:30 p.m. The menu remained invariably vegetarian and simple: boiled vegetables, noodles, potatoes. The cast of characters rarely changed either. It was a tight circle of insiders: Eva Braun, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, Albert Speer, and a few secretaries. These people knew the rules of the game. At dinner, one had to be careful. Any careless word could spoil the Führer's mood, and that threatened catastrophe for everyone. Therefore, conversations were bland, full of flattery and agreement. Everyone smiled, nodded, and ate the tasteless food, trying to please the host. But the main event of the evening was the movie screening. After dinner, the group moved to a private cinema. Hitler was a true cinephile. He watched movies almost every night and treated it with frightening seriousness. His tastes might surprise many. Alongside German historical epics about kings and great battles, he adored Hollywood. Hitler watched Disney cartoons with childlike delight. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was one of his favorites. He also loved comedies with Laurel and Hardy, laughing at their clumsy falls. Sometimes they watched propaganda films created in the depths of Goebbels' ministry. But Hitler was rarely interested in the ideological message. He took it for granted. His attention was riveted to the technical side. He discussed films like a professional director, how the lighting was set, how the actors performed, how the music was selected. He could stop the reel to criticize the set design, or, conversely, admire the special effects. In these moments, he felt like a creator, an artist, something he had failed to become in his youth. He wanted everything to be perfect, and gave long commentaries as if he were running a film studio, not a warring country. When the movie ended, for most normal people, it was time to sleep. But not for Hitler. His day was far from over. It was at night that he felt a surge of energy, mixed with a fear of being left alone with himself. He often stayed awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, keeping his exhausted entourage around him. Guests were dropping from fatigue, their eyes closing, but leaving was forbidden. Hitler invited them to the living room for a conversation, which inevitably turned into yet another monologue. These late-night gatherings went down in history as Hitler's table talk. The fire in the fireplace was dying down, and Hitler spoke. He spoke for hours. Topics jumped chaotically, from ancient Germanic myths to the harms of smoking. He was a fierce opponent of tobacco. From questions of art to plans for reshaping the world. It was a theater of the absurd. Secretaries, fighting off sleep, stenographed his every word as if it were divine revelation. Intimates, Bormann, Speer, and others sat with frozen smiles, simulating attention. Hitler saw himself not just as a politician, but as a philosopher, a prophet whose thoughts must be preserved for eternity. In reality, by this time of night, his brain was no longer producing any strategic ideas. It was self-affirmation. He needed listeners who would confirm his genius. Objections were forbidden. Disagreement was punished with disgrace. Only one thing was required from the audience: complete, unconditional, slavish agreement. Nods, approving exclamations, admiring glances. This was the fuel on which the engine of his ego ran deep into the night. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's routine began to mutate, turning into the grotesque. By 1944 and 1945, when the front was collapsing and the Allies were tightening the noose, Hitler completely retreated into isolation. In the final months, he practically never left his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. It was a concrete dungeon, devoid of natural light, filled with the hum of ventilation and the smell of fear. Here, day and night blended completely. Reality became his enemy. Hitler stopped meeting with combat commanders who brought bad news. He did not want to hear about losses, about destroyed cities, about the lack of ammunition. If someone tried to tell the truth, he flew into hysterics, accusing generals of betrayal and cowardice. Martin Bormann took full advantage of this state. He filtered information to such an extent that Hitler began living in a fictional world. He moved non-existent armies across the map, issued orders to divisions that had long been destroyed, and believed in wonder weapons that were about to save the Reich. Physically, Hitler turned into a wreck. His left hand trembled constantly, a sign of Parkinson's disease. He walked hunched over, dragging his feet. His stomach tormented him with pain. His skin took on an earthy hue. There was no trace left of the orator's former energy. He became a quiet, withdrawn old man who could stare at a single point on a map for hours, or mumble something under his breath. But even in this hell, to the sound of Soviet artillery shaking the bunker walls, he clung to the remnants of his routine. He still ate his vegetarian meals, still demanded tea with biscuits, still tried to hold nightly conversations, although there were fewer and fewer listeners. It was pure agony. The world he tried to conquer had shrunk to the size of a few concrete rooms. The routine that had served as a shield from reality for years had now become his prison. He continued to play the role of Führer, but the auditorium was empty and the theater was on fire. So what did Adolf Hitler actually do all day? He was not a Superman working without sleep or rest. He was a man who woke up late, ate soup, watched cartoons, and talked endlessly to drown out the silence. His day was woven from small things designed to create comfort and an illusion of control. He avoided responsibility, shifted boring work onto others, and hid from bad news behind Wagner's music and walks. He built an artificial world around himself in which he was a genius, and everyone else was an obedient extra. Hitler's story is a reminder that monsters do not necessarily look like monsters 24 hours a day. Sometimes a monster is just an aging, sick man who likes dogs, fears phone calls, and eats mashed potatoes, while, by his order, the world chokes on blood. And it is this mundanity, hiding behind the facade of absolute evil, that makes his figure truly terrifying. Thank you for watching to the end. If this view of the story seemed interesting to you, do not forget to rate the material with your like and subscribe to the channel. History is full of mysteries, and we have only just begun to uncover them.